Wyoming Territory, late November, 1887. The wind moves across granite ridges the color of old iron, breathing through timberlines of black spruce and lodgepole pine, breathing down a switchback trail that has not seen a stranger in 7 months. A wagon crests the rise. Two horses, one driver, one passenger in the back, bundled against a cold she has never met. The cabin sits alone against the spine of the mountain, 2 stories. A stone chimney climbing the north wall, smoke rising thin and blue into the dying light. Inside, a table set for 4, a wooden cross above the mantel, a chair pushed in for a woman 3 years in the grave. At a stump 12 feet across, 3 men wait. One stands lame, one turns his good ear to the wind, one keeps his scarred cheek to the shadow. The wagon stops. She climbs down. Her boots sink in the mud past the ankle. She looks up. 3, not 1, 3. The wagon hit another rut in the frozen November mud, and Marigold Bishop bit her lip to keep from crying out. She had been biting her lip for 4 hours now. The taste of iron was familiar. In Chicago, at the textile mill, she had bitten it through 12-hour shifts to keep the cotton dust from making her scream. Through the eviction notice slid under her door, through the last look her mother gave her before the coughing took her. 3 years back this coming Advent, biting her lip was the only prayer her body still knew how to say without words. 6 weeks from now, in a bed she had not yet slept in, she would whisper 4 words she did not know. She was carrying 4 words that would open a door in her own soul she did not know had ever been closed. But that November afternoon, in a wagon on a ridge in Wyoming Territory, the 4 words were still ahead of her, and the mud was under the wheels, and the wind was in her face, and she did not know any of it yet. The wagon driver was a stranger, a whiskered old man named Sylvanus, who chewed tobacco and spat over the wheel and had not spoken to her since the railhead at Rock Springs. Paid to deliver her, not to know her, and that suited her fine. She looked down at her lap. 2 things sat there, a canvas grip that held everything she owned in the world, 1 spare dress, 1 wool shawl, 3 darning needles, a pewter thimble, a tin of tea that had gone stale on the train, and on top of the grip, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, her mother's Bible. The Bible was heavier than the grip, not in pounds, in weight. Her mother had underlined passages in blue ink until the ink ran out, and then in pencil until the pencil broke, and then in charcoal from the stove. The book of Ruth was almost entirely blue. Whither thou goest, I will go, circled 3 times. Marigold had not read it since she left Chicago. She was afraid of what it might mean now. The wagon crested a ridge. Sylvanus spat and pointed. Yonder. She looked, and her breath went out of her body all at once. Wyoming Territory, in late November, is not a place. It is a wound in the earth. Granite spines rising black against a sky the color of old milk. Timberline of black spruce and lodgepole pine standing in ranks like they were waiting for orders. Snow already down in the passes. And the wind coming off those peaks with a sound she had never heard before. Not howling, not moaning, but breathing, like something enormous was breathing across the land. She had thought Chicago was cold. Chicago was a coat compared to this. Chicago was a candle held up against a furnace door swung open. Sylvanus clucked to the horses. They started down the ridge. Marigold gripped the Bible to her chest and thought, Lord, if this is what you meant, I'm listening. I'm here. I'm listening. The meeting place was called Cutter's Fork, and it was not a town. It was a stump. A wide, flat stump, 12 feet across, that had once been a ponderosa pine of impossible age. Somebody had carved letters into it a long time ago. Cutter 51 and moss had grown into the letters, and snow now grew on the moss, and the whole thing looked like a headstone for a giant. 3 men stood beside it. Marigold saw them from a quarter-mile out. 3, not 1, 3. Something between a swallow and a whimper caught in her throat. Sylvanus did not turn. The horses kept walking. The stump kept getting closer, and the 3 men did not move. They stood in a loose line, waiting, like men who had been waiting a long time and had learned how to wait without shifting their weight. She began, without knowing she was doing it, to catalog them. The one on the left was the tallest, broad as a barn door. Reddish-brown beard shot through with premature gray. Weight all on his right leg. The left turned out slightly, and even from a distance she could see the way his left boot pressed the mud differently than his right. Lame, she thought. He walks lame. The one in the middle was leaner. Black hair pulled back in a leather cord. Green eyes she could see from farther than she should have been able to. He held his head at an angle, right ear cocked slightly forward, as if listening past a screen. When the wagon rattled over a stone, he did not flinch at the sound. He flinched at seeing her flinch. The one on the right was the youngest, and the largest through the shoulders. Yellow hair like straw, the sun had been at all summer. A short beard, and a scar. A long, pale scar that ran from his right temple, down across his cheekbone, and along the line of his jaw, and disappeared under his collar. His right eye was warm brown. His left eye was the color of watered milk. Blind, she thought. Blind on that side. 3 broken men. Lord. She almost laughed. It came up in her chest like a sob turned inside out. Lord, I asked you for a roof, and you sent me to 3 broken men on a stump in the wilderness. Is this a joke? Lord, because if it is, I don't understand the punchline. The wagon stopped. Sylvana spat one last time. Ma'am. She climbed down. Her boots sank in the mud past the ankle. The tallest one, the lame one, took 1 step forward. Just one. He did not close the distance. He gave her the distance to close. Or to keep. Miss Bishop. His voice was not what she expected. She had expected gravel. She got something quieter, worn smooth by silence, the way river stones get worn smooth by water. I gave her his name, Amos Wintersong, and told her, without ornament, that his was the name on the paper. His hand moved slightly toward the 2 men beside him without turning. Fletcher, his middle brother. Jubal, the youngest. Not blood, but brothers, sharing one roof. She heard the words. She understood the words. She could not make her mouth work around a reply. I went on, quieter now. The contract she signed had not mentioned them. He knew that. He had meant to say it in the letter and had not. That was cowardice on his part. He was saying it now, on this stump, before she took it another step. A pause, his breath a small white cloud in the cold. Her fare back to Rock Springs was paid, he said, if she chose to turn around. The driver would wait an hour. He was paid to wait. She owed them nothing, and she owed the driver nothing, and she owed the man who had written the contract nothing. If this was not what she had thought it was, she could turn around, and no one on this ridge would speak an unkind word about her as long as they lived. Silence. The wind breathed. Somewhere very far off, a raven called once and stopped. Marigold heard herself, from a great distance, ask a question she had not planned to ask. Who cooks? Amos blinked. The middle brother Fletcher turned his head slightly to bring his good ear forward. The youngest Jubal did not move, but his good eye moved. It fixed on her mouth, the way a man reads a page he is afraid will change if he looks away. Ma'am, Amos asked. Who cooks? She repeated, for 3 grown men in a cabin in the mountains. Because if the answer was nobody, then somebody had been eating badly for a long time, and that was a thing she knew how to fix. For one long moment, none of the 3 moved. Then Jubal, the blind-eyed one, made a small sound. It was not a laugh. It was closer to the sound of a man who had forgotten a sound existed and just remembered. Amos looked down at his boots. When he looked up, something in his face had changed. Not softened. Something older than softened. Something like seen. Nobody cooked well, he told her. Their mother had. She had been gone 3 years. They had been eating badly for 3 years. Then I will stay the winter, Marigold heard herself say, and we shall see about spring when spring comes. The ride to the cabin took 4 hours more. Amos drove. Fletcher rode alongside on a shaggy bay. Jubal rode ahead, scouting, and when he came back to say the pass was clear, he did not look at her once, not directly. His good eye kept sliding sideways to her and then away, the way a boy in church looks at something holy he has been told not to look at. Marigold sat on the wagon bench beside Amos and did not speak. She was thinking. She was thinking that she had said, "I will stay the winter," the way a woman says, "I will draw one more breath," not because she chose it, but because she could not think of another option that would let her keep breathing. She was thinking that her mother's Bible was in her lap, and the wind was in her ears, and the smell of pine resin was in her nose, and none of it felt real yet. She was thinking about Benedict Ashbourne. She did not want to think about Benedict Ashbourne. But her mind, in this way of minds, went there anyway. The storeroom, the smell of apple cider vinegar in barrels, the sound of a young man's laughter that was not really laughter, the way she had shoved him and how the shove had been enough, because he was drunk and small and she was afraid, and fear had lent her arms a strength she had not asked for. The ripped sleeve, his sleeve, not hers. Mrs. Cordelia Ashbourne standing at the top of the stairs the next morning, holding a silver brooch, saying very slowly, very clearly, so that the whole household would hear, "I know you took it, girl." Marigold closed her eyes, opened them. The Wyoming pines were still there. Good, she thought. Good. The pines are still there. Chicago is not. Amos glanced sideways at her, once and away again. He had a way of not looking that was different from Jubal's way. Jubal looked away because he was overwhelmed. Amos looked away because he was giving her space. She understood the difference already. She could not have said how. They came around a bend, and the cabin appeared. It was bigger than she had expected. 2 stories, real stories, not a loft, a proper second floor with 3 small square windows. A stone chimney of river rock climbing the north wall, wide enough at the base for a man to stand inside. A porch running the length of the front, with a bench and a boot scraper and a wooden tub. A separate outbuilding for the smithy, with a slate roof so the sparks would not catch. A pole barn for the horses. A spring house. A root cellar with a door set into the hillside. Somebody had built this cabin to last 100 winters. Somebody had built it thinking the future would live here. Fletcher went in first, to build the fire back up. Jubal took the horses. Amos took her canvas grip in his left hand, the strong hand, since the lame leg made his balance uneven on the right, and offered her his right elbow to steady her over the icy porch steps. She took it. His forearm under her palm was hard as a fence post. He did not comment on her hand. He did not tighten his elbow. He simply held steady until she was on the porch, and then he released her. She stepped into the cabin, and she stopped, because the first thing she saw was a cross, a plain wooden cross, no bigger than her hand, hung over the mantelpiece, not ornate, not carved, just 2 pieces of pine, pegged together, the wood so worn by candle smoke it had gone the color of dark honey. The second thing she saw was the table. The table was set for 4, not 3, 4. 4 wooden plates, 4 tin cups, 4 spoons. The 4th place was at the head of the table, and the chair was pushed in the way. An empty chair is pushed in when the person who used to sit in it has been gone long enough that no one will pull it out anymore. But no one will put the plate away either. She understood, without being told, whose place it was. Their mother. 3 years, and they still lay her plate. Something inside Marigold's chest, something small and hard and locked, that had been locked since her own mother died, turned over. Just once, just a quarter turn, like a key. She did not weep. She had learned very young not to weep in front of strangers. But she stood very still in the doorway of that cabin, and she looked at that 4th plate, and she thought, Lord, Lord, what have you brought me to? Amos, behind her, said nothing. He had seen her see it. That was enough. Her eyes, adjusting to the firelight, moved over the mantel. A pewter candlestick, a small tin holding matches, and, at the far right end, a small oval frame, face down deliberately, the way a photograph is set when the person in it is remembered too much and looked at too little. She did not ask. She would learn later. That night, after a supper of beans and dried elk and a wedge of hard cheese she would have wept over in Chicago, Amos showed her to her room. Upstairs, 2nd floor, the east-facing room, so the morning sun would find her first. It had a real bed, A rope-strung frame with a straw tick and a feather tick over that, and 3 heavy quilts folded at the foot, a washstand with a china basin, a small window with a real pane of glass, a luxury. Out here, and a wooden shutter that could be barred from the inside. There was a bolt on the door, an iron bolt, thick as her thumb, on the inside of the door. She saw it, and she looked at Amos. Amos was standing in the hall, not in her room. Never once had he crossed the threshold of her room. He had stopped at the doorframe like a man stopped by an invisible fence. The bolt was new, he told her. Fletcher had put it on that morning. He had asked Amos not to mention who put it on, because Fletcher got embarrassed when he was caught being thoughtful. But she would find him out soon enough, and it was easier to tell the truth now. I explained the sleeping arrangements the way a man might explain the order of the woodpile. He would sleep in the barn until she had got the measure of them. Fletcher slept across the hall, Jubal downstairs, on a pallet by the smithy stove, because he claimed the stove reminded him of their mother. That was not true, but they let him say it, because he needed a reason, and that was the reason he had chosen. Bar the door if she liked. Do not bar it if she liked. Either way, no one would try it. Good night. He turned. He limped down the narrow stairs. He was gone. Marigold stood alone in the room. She looked at the bolt. She did not shoot it. She stood a long time looking at it. And then she sat down on the edge of the feather tick, and she put her mother's Bible on the pillow beside her where a husband might have been. And she said out loud to the empty room, "Lord, I do not understand this house." The wind answered from the eaves. She undressed by lamplight. She put on the cotton shift she had washed twice on the train. She braided her hair honey gold in the lamp, ash gold in the corners where the light did not reach, and she climbed under the 3 heavy quilts, and the straw ticked under her, and the feather ticked over her, and she was warmer than she had been since childhood, and she did not bar the door. She left it unlocked. Not because she trusted them, not yet, because she wanted to see, in the morning, whether the door was still where she left it. The door was still where she left it. She woke to the smell of coffee and burning bread. She sat up. The window was silver with frost. The 3 quilts had slid, and her nose was cold, and her feet were warm, and for one bewildered second she did not know what state she was in, what year, whose bed. Then she smelled the bread burning, and she remembered. I told them I could cook. She was down the stairs in 90 seconds. Braid loose, shawl over shift, boots unlaced. She hit the kitchen and Fletcher, the middle one, black hair, green eyes, good ear turned toward the stove like he was interrogating. It was standing over the cast-iron skillet with a face of pure innocent tragedy. Holding a wooden spoon like a man holding a rifle, he does not know how to fire. Miss Bishop, he informed her without looking up. I have made a mistake. Move. He moved. She grabbed the skillet with a rag, yanked it off the stovetop. Her thumb brushed the iron and she hissed and jerked, and a bright, blistering pain flashed up her hand. She dropped the skillet with a clang on the hearthstone. The bread was a disaster. Black on the bottom, doughy on top, salt where sugar should have been. She could tell from the smell. She stood there panting and holding her thumb to her mouth. Fletcher looked at the skillet. Fletcher looked at her thumb. In the calmest voice she had ever heard from a grown man, he told her that he had been trying to surprise her. You surprised me. She agreed around her thumb. That was not the surprise I had planned. No. Fletcher tilted the wooden spoon at the skillet with the melancholy air of a general surveying a lost battle, and inquired for professional purposes. He said whether it counted as a bad surprise or an interesting one. She stared at him, horrified that a laugh had cracked out of her before she could stop it. Half laugh, half yelp, muffled by her thumb. He stared back equally horrified that he had caused it. And for one shining second the kitchen was quiet in a way that was not the quiet of the mountain, but the quiet of 2 strangers who have accidentally become something else. Then boots on the porch. Jubal came in with an armload of split wood. He saw the skillet on the hearthstone. He saw Fletcher unarmed. He saw Marigold with her thumb in her mouth. His one good eye tracked all of this in about 3 seconds, and then he crossed the kitchen in 2 strides, set the wood down without a sound, took Marigold's wrist in his enormous hand very gently. The way a man handles a bird, turned her palm up, looked at the burn, and grunted. Honey. It was the first word he had spoken to her. Ma'am, she did not understand. Honey, for the burn. Wild honey, in the crock. Second shelf. He let go of her wrist, went to the shelf, came back with a small brown crock, took her hand again with that gentleness that did not match his size, and smeared a fingertip of honey across the blister. His touch was rough as bark. His fingers smelled like iron and pine. He did not look at her face while he did it. He looked at her thumb like her thumb was the most important thing in the territory. Mother used to do this, he told her thumb, when they were boys. Any burn, any cut, honey first, bandage second, never lost a finger between the three of them. He looked up. He looked her in the face. Once, with his good eye. The scarred side was toward the window, and the morning light caught the milk white of his left eye and made it almost silver. He looked away. There, he said, and he went to the wood bin, and he stacked the wood, and he did not speak again all morning. Marigold stood with honey on her thumb. Fletcher, behind her, remarked to no one in particular, as if he had not meant her to hear that his brother had not spoken that many words in a row since October. That was the first day. The second day, Amos taught her the stove. I did not lecture. Amos did not lecture about anything. Ever. He came in from the barn with snow on his shoulders, stamped his boots, took off his coat, and gave her the stove the way a man gives another man the reins of a horse he knows well. The stove ran hot on the left side. Draft pulled that way. Keep her bread to the right. A quarter turn every 6 minutes. Watch the crust. When it went gold at the edge, count to 60 and pull it. She nodded. Also, he added, the door hinges drooped. If she closed it hard, the latch would not catch. Lift as she closed. Do not slam. She nodded. Also, the ash pan was loose. If she pulled it fast, the ashes would spill. Slow. She nodded. That was enough for one morning. He decided. She could ask him the rest when she wanted to know, and he went out to split wood. She stood by the stove for a long moment, and then she picked up her mother's Bible from the mantel where she had set it. She had begun, without deciding to, treating the mantel as a small altar, and she pressed it to her chest. And she thought, he teaches the way Mama used to teach. He teaches like he thinks I will still be here to remember. By the end of the first week, she had learned 3 things. She had learned that Amos slept in the barn. Not sometimes. Every night. She had risen twice before dawn to be sure. The bed in the room downstairs, the room that had clearly been meant to be his, was made every morning without a wrinkle, because it was never slept in. He took his blanket to the pole barn, and he slept on straw with the horses, and he came back at first light with hay in his beard and cold in his bones, and he never once said a word about it. She asked Fletcher why. They were at the kitchen table. She was darning a sock. Fletcher was reading, actually reading, out of a leather-bound book, a book of poetry by a man named Tennyson. She had heard of but never held, and he looked up over the pages and turned his good ear toward her. Ask him yourself. I cannot ask him myself. Why not? Because he will lie. Fletcher set the Tennyson down, spine up. He was careful with fragile things and rough with sturdy ones, and he knew which was which without seeming to think about it. She had been in this house 8 days, he told her, and she already knew Amos better than most people who had known him 8 years. She protested. He grinned a slow, crooked grin that used the left corner of his mouth more than the right, as if the smile was leaving from the side where he could hear better, and told her to ask him a different question. She thought about it, then quieter. Why did he sleep in the barn? That, said Fletcher, was the same question. She let the darning fall in her lap. I explained it slowly, the way a man explains a difficult verse. Amos slept in the barn because Amos had signed the paper. His name was on the contract, and Amos was a man who understood, better than most, that a woman who had traveled 1,200 miles to a place she had never seen, at the request of a man she had never met, was entitled to be certain every night, all night, without wondering that the man whose name was on that paper was not under the same roof as her while she slept, until she said otherwise. Marigold set down her needle. That was a great deal to ask of a man in November, she said. In Wyoming. Amos did not ask. Fletcher told her. Amos did. She looked at the fire. How long did he mean to sleep in the barn? Fletcher picked up his Tennyson again, turned a page, as long as it took. The second thing she learned was that Fletcher could read. Not just read, read. He had a shelf. She discovered it on the 10th day, behind a curtain in the front room, on a shelf pegged into the wall, 3 rows deep, Shakespeare in 2 volumes, Dickens, 4 books, a Bible with commentaries, a geography of the Rocky Mountains, Longfellow, Tennyson, a book in French she could not read the title of, and a slim green book with the words Sermons of the Reverend Charles Spurgeon stamped in gold on the spine. She stared at the shelf. She had assumed because she was ashamed of it later that a man in buckskin in a cabin in Wyoming did not have books. Fletcher came up behind her without a sound. She startled. His mother's. He told her. She had been a governess in Philadelphia before she came west. She had taught the 3 of them out of these. All three. Amos read slow because his eyes tired. Jubal read with the 1, and it wore him out by the 3rd page. But he could. Mother would not have it any other way. She said. He paused, corrected himself. She says, present tense. They had not switched her over yet. She says a man who cannot read is a man another man can lie to, and she would not have any son of hers lied to. Marigold reached out. She touched the spine of the Spurgeon. Might she borrow it? She might borrow anything on that shelf as long as she lived, Fletcher told her. And if she outlived him, she might keep them all. The third thing she learned was Jubal's scar. Not the shape of it, the shape she had learned the first hour, the story of it. She learned the story on the 14th day, and she did not learn it from Jubal. She learned it from Amos. They were on the porch. She had brought him a tin cup of coffee, because she had begun bringing him a tin cup of coffee every afternoon around 3, without deciding to, without either of them commenting on it, and he had begun accepting it every afternoon around 3, without deciding to, without either of them commenting on that either. He was sitting on the porch bench with his lame legs stretched out straight in front of him, a thing he did only when he thought no one was watching, because sitting with the legs straight meant he was hurting, and Amos did not like to be seen hurting. She handed him the cup. She sat down, not close, 2 feet away. 2 feet was the distance they had settled on. It was the distance at which neither of them was uncomfortable, and it was a distance neither of them ever mentioned. She asked if she might ask him something. He drank. She might ask. His leg? He drank. Yes. Was it the war? He set the cup down on the bench between them. The war was a piece of it. He told her. Not the piece that mattered. The piece that mattered was Jubal. She waited. He looked out at the ridge. The sun was low. The pines were black against gold. Somewhere in the trees a nuthatch was calling. 8 years ago that coming June, Amos said, Jubal had been 20. Gone up to the North Creek to fish. A good boy. Still a good boy. But a boy then. He had not known that a she-grizzly with cubs had come down to the creek that morning. Had not known that a man on foot with a fishing pole is exactly the wrong thing to be. On that creek, on that morning, he drank, set the cup down. He had heard Jubal yell from a quarter-mile off. He had run. His leg had still been his own leg then. He had run, and he had got there, and he had seen what was happening, and he had done what any brother would do. He had put himself between the bear and his brother. He turned his cup on the bench. The bear had taken his leg in her jaws. She had broken it in 3 places. Broken his hip. She would have broken the rest of him. But Fletcher had come up behind them with the Sharps rifle their mother kept over the door, and Fletcher had put a ball in that bear's shoulder at 40 paces, and the bear had run. She had run. She had not died. She had gone back to her cubs. That was the important thing. She had cubs. She had been doing what a mother does. He did not blame her for his leg. He stopped. Marigold said nothing. Jubal had lost the eye. Amos said her claw had taken it before he got there. Jubal did not remember the moment it happened. He remembered running to the creek, and he remembered waking up in their mother's bed 3 days later with a linen bandage over half his face, and their mother saying to him, Amos would never forget this. He told Marigold. He had been in the room and he had heard her. Their mother had said to Jubal, your brother is alive. Your face is still your face. God has been merciful. Now go back to sleep. Amos picked up the cup. He did not drink. He held it in both hands. He limped, he said, because he had loved Jubal more than he had loved his own leg. That was all. It was not a heroic story. It was only a story about a man doing the thing any man would do for a brother, and the brother happening to be worth it, because Jubal had been worth it. Jubal was the best of them. He drank the last of the coffee. He handed her the empty cup. He did not look at her. I had not told that story to anyone outside the family since their mother died. He said he was telling her because she was inside the family now. Whether she decided to stay or not, she had already been let in. She could not be unlet in. That was not how it worked in this house. He stood up. He gathered his cane. He limped down the porch steps toward the woodpile, and he did not look back. Marigold sat on the porch bench with the empty tin cup in her hands. She sat there until the sun went behind the ridge. She sat there until Fletcher came out and asked her if she was cold. She was cold. She had not noticed. Later, when the cold had driven her back inside, she found herself alone by the mantel. Her eyes went, without her deciding, to the small oval frame face down at the far end. She did not touch it, but she stood there a full minute before Fletcher came in with an armload of kindling. And Fletcher, who saw a great many things without appearing to set the kindling down and, without turning to look at what she was looking at, said very quietly to the fire that her name had been Delphine, and she had been his brother's wife, and she had died 5 years back this coming February. And Amos did not speak of her. Marigold did not ask another question. She only nodded, once, as if she had been given a piece of information she would have to carry now, and she went to help Fletcher with the wood. That was the second week, the third week. The first blizzard came. She had thought the wind in November was cold. The wind in December, when the first real blizzard rolled down out of the Absaroka Range on the 4th of the month, was not weather. It was not wind. It was a living thing. It came at the cabin from the north with a sound like an ocean full of knives, and the windows of the cabin trembled in their frames, and the fire in the hearth guttered sideways every time somebody opened a door, and the temperature in the loft, her loft. Her east-facing room dropped so hard that she could see her breath by candlelight for 3 nights running. On the second night of the blizzard, she got the fever. She did not know she had it. At first, she only knew that she was hot, and then cold, and then hot again, and that the beans she had eaten for supper tasted metallic on the back of her tongue. She went upstairs early. She lay down under the 3 quilts. She dreamed. She dreamed of Chicago. She dreamed of the storeroom. She dreamed of a young man's hand on her mouth, and the smell of vinegar in barrels, and the terrible small sound of her own dress tearing at the shoulder. She dreamed she pushed him. He fell, his mother at the top of the stairs holding a silver brooch, saying, "I know you took it. Girl, I know you took it. I know." She dreamed she screamed, and then she was screaming, actually screaming, out loud, in a bed in Wyoming Territory in the middle of a blizzard, boots on the stairs. She heard them through the fever. The stairs took 2 people at once. She registered that, dimly, and she was afraid, and she tried to sit up and could not, and she flailed at the quilts with hands that felt like somebody else's hands, and she called out. She did not know for whom she called. She called for her mother. She called for God. She called a name she had not spoken since she was 7, and then the door opened, and someone was in the room with her. Amos. She knew him by the limp. She knew him by the shape of his shoulder against the lamplight in the hall. He had come in from the barn. His hair was white with snow. He carried the lamp in one hand and his coat was still on, and he crossed the room in 3 uneven strides, and he was on his knees by the bed. Miss Bishop. She was shaking. He named himself again. Amos. He was there. She had cried out. Fletcher had heard her. Fletcher had come to the barn. He was there. Her hand, she did not remember reaching her hand, had found the front of his coat, had gripped it, had fisted in the wool. She was gripping him like a drowning woman grips a rope. It was a dream, she told him, or she thought she told him. The words came out cracked. Only a dream. Chicago. He had been in Chicago. He was not here. Was he not here? I was not here, Amos told her, quietly, steadily, like a man calming a horse. whoever he was. Not in this house, not on this mountain, not in this territory. His word, she was crying. She had not known she was crying. Her whole body was shaking with it. And the fever was in her, and the dream was in her, and Chicago was in her. And the hand that had ripped her sleeve was in her. And she could not stop. Amos did not move. He knelt by the bed with his coat gripped in her fist. He did not touch her. He did not reach for her. He held the lamp steady, and he waited. The way a man waits out a storm because a storm cannot be argued with. And after a very long time, she did not know how long, she began to breathe again. Then, and only then, he spoke. Marigold. Not Miss Bishop. Not once. In that whole exchange, had he said Miss, he said her name. Did she want him to send Fletcher for the doctor? The doctor was 2 days out in this weather. But they would go if she wanted. She shook her head. Water, she nodded. He rose, he limped to the washstand. He poured. He came back. He knelt again, his lame leg audibly protesting, and he held the tin cup to her lips, and she drank. And some of the water spilled down her chin, and he wiped it with his sleeve, and he did not comment on it, and he set the cup on the floor. She was still gripping his coat. She could not seem to unclench her hand. Amos looked down at her fist in his coat. He looked at her face. He looked at the fist again, very gently. He told her what he meant to do. He was going to sit down on the floor. He was not going to leave. He was going to sit against the bed frame and stay there until she slept. Was that all right? She nodded. He sat, his back against the bed frame, his lame leg out, his good leg drawn up, her fist still in his coat, because she could not let go, because if she let go, she would fall back into Chicago. And Amos seemed to understand this without being told. She said, around the fever, around the tears, around the dream and the smell of vinegar and the terrible small sound of tearing wool. She said the words that came up out of her without her permission, the words she had been holding in her mouth since the moment his voice first went quiet at Cutter's Fork. It hurts. Amos did not move. It hurts. Amos. Not what you think. Not tonight. Just inside. It hurts inside. I cannot do it tonight. I cannot even talk about it tonight. Let's try again tomorrow night. I will be braver tomorrow. I will try. Just not tonight. Please. She heard herself. She heard how it sounded. She wanted to take it back because she was talking about her own soul, and he might think she was talking about the marriage bed, and she had no strength to explain the difference, and she opened her mouth to explain and could not. Amos understood. She did not know how. She would wonder, for the rest of her life, how. But he understood. She felt him understand. She felt it in the way his shoulder braced against the bed frame under her fist went still, and stayed still, and did not shift toward her by so much as an inch. Into the dark, into the wind, into the guttering candle. He told her that she did not have to try again tomorrow night. She did not have to try again the night after. She did not have to try at all. Not for him, not for the paper, not for anyone in this house. Silence. The wind. Sleep. He said, I am not going anywhere. And then, because he was a man who had been raised by a governess from Philadelphia who kept a Spurgeon on the shelf, he began very quietly, so quietly she was not sure at first that she was hearing it to sing. Rock of Ages is cleft for me. Let me hide myself in thee. His voice was low, rough, uncertain of the tune. He got the second verse wrong and started over. She almost laughed, in the middle of her weeping, at the small, honest wrongness of it. Let the water and the blood, from thy wounded side which flowed, be of sin the double cure. She fell asleep before the double cure. Her fist stayed in his coat until dawn. He did not move. At first light, she woke to the smell of wood smoke and the sound of a broom. Someone was sweeping the hall outside her door. She turned her head very carefully, because her head hurt, and she saw that Amos was gone from the floor. His coat was folded on the chair by the washstand. A fresh cup of water stood on the nightstand, and her hand, her right hand, the hand that had gripped him all night, held a small square of white linen. She unfolded it. It was a handkerchief, embroidered in the corner, in blue thread, In a hand that had grown shaky with age were the initials H, W, Hepzibah Wintersong. Their mother's. She held it to her face. It smelled faintly of cedar and lavender, and under both of pine resin and iron, from a night spent in a man's coat pocket. Marigold Bishop lay in a bed in Wyoming Territory in the first blizzard of December, and she pressed a dead woman's handkerchief to her mouth, and she wept for the first time in 3 years the way a daughter weeps. Outside her door, the sweeping stopped. She heard Jubal's voice low, private, meant for Fletcher and not for her, say through the boards. She's crying. And Fletcher, quieter still. Let her. That kind needs to. The sweeping resumed, and in the barn, though she did not know it yet, Amos Wintersong was sitting on a bale of straw with his forehead pressed against the flank of a warm horse, and he was saying out loud, to a horse who did not care, because he had to say it to something, Lord, Lord, what have you brought to this house? The wind moved through the barn eaves in a sound almost like an old woman sighing. The same wind that had answered from her room. The same answer. The fever broke on the 3rd day. Marigold came back to herself the way a person comes back from a long trip, not all at once, but in pieces. First the smell of coffee, then the shape of the ceiling boards above her. Each not familiar now, each grain memorized without her knowing she had memorized them. Then the weight of the 3 quilts. Then, finally, the sound of a broom on the porch below her window, a slow, patient sweeping that had been going on. She understood without knowing how. For hours. She sat up. Her head did not spin. That was new. She swung her feet to the floor. Her feet did not shake. That was new too. Someone had left a tin cup of water on the nightstand. Someone had left a plate covered with a clean cloth beside it. She lifted the cloth. 2 biscuits golden, not black, and a smear of wild honey in a saucer. She stared at the biscuits. She began quietly to laugh because a week ago she had burned the biscuits, and now 3 grown men in a house in Wyoming had learned how to make them well enough to feed a sick woman. And the world was very strange, and the Lord had a sense of humor she had not credited him with before. She ate 1 biscuit. She put the other in the pocket of her shawl for later. She went downstairs. The kitchen was empty. The fire was burning low but steady. Someone had banked it right. She checked the wood bin full. She checked the water bucket full. She checked the stove swept clean. The ash pan slid in slow enough not to spill. Amos. She could tell Amos had been in the kitchen the way a tracker can tell an animal has been through the brush. Nothing was disturbed. Nothing was displayed. Everything was simply ready, so that a woman coming down the stairs after 3 days of fever would find no chore waiting. She stood in the middle of the kitchen with her mother's Bible clutched against her chest. She had brought it down without deciding to, the way she brought her mother's Bible everywhere now, and she said, out loud, to the empty room, "Empty room, Lord, what is happening in this house?" The Lord did not answer. The Lord, she was beginning to suspect, did not need to answer, because the answer was already sitting on a bench on the porch drinking coffee at 3 in the afternoon. The next weeks moved. They moved the way winter moves in the mountains slowly on the surface, so that a person could believe nothing was happening. Underneath everything was happening. Amos taught her the axe. Lower on the haft, he told her, standing behind her on the porch step. She was swinging from her elbows. Let the weight of the iron do the work. The axe wanted to fall. Let it. She adjusted her grip. She swung. The log split cleanly down the middle, a bright pale wound of new wood, and the halves fell away. And she laughed, actually laughed, out loud. One sharp bark of surprise and turned to Amos with her whole face lit up. Amos did not smile, but the corners of his eyes crinkled. She had learned, in 3 weeks of watching him, that the crinkle was a smile. Amos's mouth did not have the muscle memory anymore. His eyes had kept it. If you did not know to look at his eyes, you would think he never smiled at anything. If you knew, you saw that he smiled at a great many things, and most of them, lately, were her. Again. She swung again. Fletcher taught her to read past what she already knew. Not the alphabet. She had her letters. Her mother had seen to that in the boarding house between coughs. But Fletcher taught her to read the way a musician teaches another musician to hear, pulling passages out of the Spurgeon, out of the Tennyson, out of the Book of Ruth, reading them aloud with his good ear turned to her mouth so he could catch her cadence. Read it again. That verse, the one from Ruth, she read. Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee for whither thou goest. I will go. Stop. She stopped. She was reading it like a girl in Sunday school. Read it like a woman who meant it. She lowered the Bible. She thought. She began again. Entreat me not to leave thee. Slower. The words tasting different in her mouth, as if the words had been waiting for her to grow into them. Or to return from following after thee, for whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Fletcher did not applaud. Fletcher, when a thing was well done, did not applaud. He simply nodded once and looked into the fire, and she understood that the nod was worth more than applause from a man who applauded easily. That, he told her, was how Mother read it, and that was the highest praise Fletcher had. Jubal taught her fire, not the hearth fire, the forge fire. She had wandered out to the smithy on the 10th day of her recovery. Curious, because Jubal disappeared into that outbuilding every morning after breakfast and did not come out until noon. She had heard the ring of hammer on iron and the sigh of the bellows, and she had gone out through the packed snow with her shawl around her head, and she had stood in the smithy door. Jubal was at the anvil. I was in his shirt sleeves in a room where the cold outside was 10 below and the heat inside was 100. His yellow hair was dark with sweat. His good eye was fixed on the piece of iron in his tongs. His scar was the color of the coals. The light of the forge made it look, for one strange moment, as if the scar were the source of the fire and not the fire the source of the light on the scar. He did not see her, or he did, and he did not stop. She watched him lift the iron out of the coals and lay it on the horn of the anvil and hit it 3 quick blows, then a pause, then 2 heavier ones, and turn the iron a quarter and hit again. She watched the sparks jump. She watched his shoulders move. She watched the shape of the metal change from a straight bar to a curve, from a curve to a hook. From a hook to a shape, she recognized the pot hook to hang a kettle over a fire. She was making a pot hook. She realized he was making her a pot hook because the old one had cracked yesterday, and she had said, out loud, at supper, I will have to find another way to hang the kettle. And Jubal had said nothing, and now here he was in the smithy at 6 in the morning, making her a pot hook. He plunged the iron into the water barrel. Steam roared up. He turned. He saw her. His hand did not stop. He set the tongs down slowly. He wiped his good eye on his shoulder. He did not speak. Might she come in? He nodded. She crossed the smithy floor. It was gritty with cinders. It smelled of iron and pine smoke and the sharp mineral tang of hot water on hot metal. It smelled, she thought, like a place where things were really made, out of raw earth, by a man's hands, and she had never been in such a place before. She stopped at the anvil. Jubal picked up a small hammer. He held it out to her. Handle first. Not that one, she said. That one is yours. He shook his head. That one was a striker's hammer. Small. Easy. She should try it. She took the hammer. It was heavier than she expected. She adjusted her grip. Jubal picked up a piece of scrap iron, a short bar, red at one end from the coals, and laid it on the anvil. Listen to the fire, he told her without looking at her. Not the fire in the forge, the fire in the iron. When it was ready, it would tell her. Hit it once. Not twice, once. She looked at the iron. She looked at Jubal's face. His good eye was on the iron. His scarred side was in shadow. She hit the iron. Once, the bar bent. She stared at it. She had bent metal. With her hand. With a hammer. She, Marigold Bishop, who had spent 19 years being told what she could not do, and could not have, and could not be had. With one blow, bent iron. She looked up. Jubal was watching her face. His good eye had gone soft in a way she had not seen from him before. There was something in his face that she did not have a name for, and she was afraid to name it. And she looked away. Again. She hit it again. The bar bent farther. Again. Again. She had started it. He told her. He would finish it. When she used it, when she hung her kettle on it, this winter and next winter and the winter after that, she would know I started this. And that was a thing every person in a house should be able to say about one thing in the house. One thing you started with your own hand. Otherwise, a house was only a place you slept in. It was not a place you lived in. She handed him the bar. She did not trust her voice. She went back to the kitchen, and she stood over the stove for a long time doing nothing. And Fletcher, who saw a great many things without appearing to, came in from the porch and looked at her face and said nothing and put the kettle on himself. Christmas Eve came that year on a Tuesday. There was no minister on the mountain, and the snow was too deep for the mule ride down to Silver Bow, and none of the three brothers had marked Christmas properly since their mother had died. Marigold understood this without asking. She had lit the kitchen lamp that morning and seen the flat, careful way Fletcher poured the coffee, and the flat, careful way Jubal ate the biscuit, and the flat, careful way Amos read the paper. Three men going through a day that was not going to be a day, because it was easier not to name it a day at all. She named it herself. She took the small square of white linen from the top drawer of the washstand, Hepzibah's handkerchief, and she folded it into the pocket of her apron. She went down to the kitchen and, without saying what she was doing, she began to bake. She baked slowly. She used the last of the good flour. She used a pinch of the cinnamon Fletcher had produced from a locked tin she had not been shown before. She made a small dark cake with dried apples in it, no bigger than a supper plate. She glazed it with honey. When it came out of the oven, she set it on a china plate she had washed twice. She set the plate on the mantel, next to the cross, and beside it she set Hepzibah's handkerchief, folded so that the blue thread H showed. Then she went to the front room and she stood in the doorway and she called the three of them in. They came. They saw the cake. They saw the handkerchief. They saw the mantel arranged like a small altar. None of them spoke. Fletcher moved first. He crossed to the shelf. He drew out an old harmonica she had never seen before, a small nickel-plated thing. The finish gone dull with age, and he weighed it in his palm as if he were weighing whether to lift it to his mouth at all. He looked at Amos. Amos gave him the slightest nod. Fletcher played. The first note was thin, the second was worse. He had not touched the instrument in 3 years, and his lungs did not remember. But by the third bar the tune came back to him. "O Little Town of Bethlehem," played slow and true, and Marigold sat down on the settle without being invited, and closed her eyes and let the sound go into her. Amos sat in his father's chair with his lame leg out. Jubal sat on the hearth. He was holding something in his lap. He had brought it in from the smithy in the pocket of his shirt, and he was turning it over and over in his fingers, and Marigold had not noticed until now. When the hymn ended, Jubal cleared his throat. She almost did not hear him. He crossed the room in 3 strides, knelt on one knee beside the settle the way a man kneels at communion, and he held out the thing in his hand. It was a cross, a small carved cross, no bigger than her thumb, cedar, sanded smooth, oiled dark, a hole drilled through the top for a leather cord, and the cord already threaded and knotted. For her, he said, because he had seen her carry her mother's Bible in and out of rooms for 6 weeks, and he had thought perhaps she might like something she could wear on her person, something under her collar, something that did not need a hand to hold it. Marigold took the cross. She put it around her neck. It fell warm against her collarbone. She reached for his hand, without deciding to, the way she had reached for Amos's coat in the fever, and she pressed his calloused fingers between both of hers, and she thanked him, and she could not say more. Amos rose then. From the shelf behind the Spurgeon he took a Bible, not the family Bible, a smaller one, worn at the corners, and he opened it to Luke chapter 2, and he read, "And she brought forth her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn." Marigold sat with her hand still in Jubal's hand, and the small cross warm against her throat, and Hepzibah's handkerchief folded on the mantel above the cross of pine. And she thought with a clarity that came without warning, Lord, I have never had a Christmas. I have had days in December in which nothing happened, but I have never had a Christmas. This is my first, and I am 19 years old. She did not weep. She only leaned, without meaning to, against Jubal's shoulder. He did not move. He sat very still, kneeling on one knee beside the settle, and let her weight rest against him for as long as she needed to rest it there. Which was, in the end, until the Luke reading was finished, and Fletcher had played one more slow tune, and the fire had burned down to red coals, and the mountain outside was as quiet as a mountain gets on the one night of the year the whole world agrees to hold its breath. She was learning. She was learning that this house had a language, and the language was not spoken. The language was Amos brought the coffee before she asked. Fletcher put a book on the arm of her chair without saying which book, and let her decide whether to pick it up. Jubal shortened the reach of the kitchen shelf because he had noticed, without her ever mentioning it, that she went on her toes to reach the salt. They did not say, "I care for you." They said, "I noticed." And in the language of that house, I noticed was the whole of it. The first hard trouble came in the second week of January. Hoofbeats, not one horse, two. Marigold was at the stove. She had put a pot of venison stew on to simmer, and she was slicing bread. And she heard the hoofbeats a full minute before Fletcher, who had the worst hearing, cocked his head. She had learned to hear a horse coming, up on the ridge, before any of them. Her ears were younger. It was one of the small ways she was useful, and she counted it, and she was proud of it in a way she did not say aloud. Two riders, she told them, coming up the switchback, not fast. Amos was at the table, oiling the Sharp's rifle. He set the rag down. He stood. He picked up the Sharps and without hurry, without theater, worked the breech to make sure a cartridge was chambered, and set the rifle upright against the doorframe where a man could reach it in one step. Fletcher slid off the bench and went to the window. Jubal came in from the smithy. He had heard the change in Amos's movements more than the horses and stood in the kitchen door with the coal dust still on his knuckles and did not speak. Marigold set the bread knife down. Her heart had begun to knock. She did not know why. She did not know for certain, but her heart knew before she did, the way her heart had known Chicago before her mind would name it. From the window, Fletcher spoke very quietly. Marshal's badge, Wyoming territory, and a rider he did not know, both armed, coming slow. Amos looked at Marigold. Just once. One look. Whatever this was. He told her. She said nothing. She let him talk. If he asked her a question in front of them, she answered only that one question. She did not offer anything, did not deny anything. She said what was true if she said anything. But she said as little as true would allow. She nodded. Her mouth had gone dry. More gently, she was not alone in this room. She nodded again. She could not have spoken. The knock came. Amos opened the door. Marshal Percival Drake was a tall man, tall as Amos, but built lighter, and older by 20 years. He had gray side whiskers and a black hat and a badge that had not been polished in a while, which told Marigold, because she had grown up watching servants, that he was a man who thought the badge did the work for him. Behind him stood a squat man in a canvas duster who did not introduce himself and did not need to. The bounty was on his belt in the shape of two heavy Colt pistols and the look of a man who had used them without losing sleep. Winter Song, Drake, cold ride up, colder if you go back down after dark. The marshal smiled. It was not a smile that reached the eyes. He looked past Amos. Into the cabin, his gaze slid over Fletcher at the window, over Jubal in the kitchen doorway, and landed on Marigold at the stove. His smile widened by half an inch. "Ah," he murmured. There she was. He drew a folded paper from inside his coat. He held it up. He did not step forward. He held it so that Amos would have to reach for it, a small piece of theater, meant to make Amos come to him. Amos did not reach. Amos stood in the door with the Sharps propped one arm's length behind him and told Drake to read it out. He had no interest in reading Chicago handwriting in this light. The marshal's smile went thin. He unfolded the paper. He read, "Warrant, Chicago Police Department, City of Cook County, Illinois, Suspect 1 Marigold Bishop, aged 19, dark blonde, gray-eyed, formerly employed in the household of Mrs. Cordula Ashbourne of Prairie Avenue, Chicago. Charge grand larceny. Value of item taken, $300. Item 1, silver and garnet mourning brooch. Property of Mrs. Ashbourne. Reward for delivery of said suspect to any U.S. Marshal or authorized deputy, $500. He folded the paper. I looked at Marigold. $500, he told her, was a great deal of money for a woman who took a train west and a cabin in the pines. He had come a long way to have a conversation with her. It would go easier for everyone if the conversation was short. Marigold's hand, she noticed this at a distance. As if her hand belonged to another woman, set the bread knife down on the sideboard. She did not speak. She had been told to let Amos talk. Amos talked. Drake had no warrant of extradition from a Wyoming judge. He pointed out, only a Chicago paper. Chicago paper did not compel a Wyoming citizen. Miss Bishop was his wife. She was a citizen of this territory as of the day she signed the parish register at Silverbow. Drake could not take her back to Illinois on a paper from Illinois. Drake knew that. Amos knew that. It was time to stop trying to make it look otherwise. Drake's smile came back. Well, he drawled. The mountain man knew some law. The mountain man had a mother, Amos said. Who taught him? Drake looked at the bounty man. The bounty man's hand had drifted, without hurry, toward the butt of his right pistol. Fletcher, at the window, did not appear to move. But Marigold, who had learned by now to watch, saw Fletcher's right hand slide 2 inches along the sill toward the second sharps that lived on pegs above the window, and saw Jubal in the kitchen doorway shift his weight forward an inch, and knew, without anyone having said a word, that in the next 3 seconds this room could go from a conversation to a killing floor. Amos knew it too. Amos did not move. Amos, very quietly, he had 3 men in this house. Drake had 1. He had known this cabin for 18 years. Drake had never been in it. Do the arithmetic slow, he suggested, because doing it fast would produce the wrong answer. Drake did the arithmetic. His smile thinned. His hand did not go to his own gun. He was, whatever else he was, not a fool. I would have paper from a Wyoming judge inside 3 weeks. He informed them, perhaps 4, in this weather. When he had that paper, Winter Song, he would come back up this mountain, and he would bring more than 1 rider. They might consider themselves informed. Consider ourselves informed, Amos said. Drake tipped his hat past Amos's shoulder in Marigold's direction. She looked well, he told her. He would not have thought a Chicago mill girl would take to Wyoming. He stood corrected. He turned, he mounted. The bounty man mounted. They rode. Amos closed the door. He set the bolt. He turned. Marigold's knees went. She did not fall. She caught herself on the sideboard, but her knees went, and she made a sound in her throat that was not quite a sob and not quite a word. And then Jubal was there from the kitchen door, in 2 long strides, and he had his hand under her elbow. And Fletcher was there from the window with a chair, and Amos was crossing the room slowly, taking his time, giving her the space to be caught by his brothers first. And she sat down in the chair. She began to cry. Not loudly. The way she had learned to cry in Chicago, with her hand over her mouth, so that the household would not hear. Amos knelt. He knelt with his lame leg out to the side, and he was in front of her, at eye level, and he did not touch her. Marigold. Her name in his mouth still undid her. Marigold. Look at me. She looked. Tell us. She told them. It came out in pieces. The storeroom. The smell of vinegar. Benedict Ashbourne, 26, drunk on his mother's sherry. A small, pale man with a small, pale laugh, who had followed her down the back stairs when she went to fetch preserves for the parlor. Her elbow in his throat when he grabbed her. Her shove a good shove, a mill girl's shove, honed on 10-hour shifts against machines that did not care whether you lived or died, and Benedict falling, and his sleeve tearing on the corner of a barrel, and his eyes going wide, and his mouth opening in a small round shape of astonishment, because no one, in his 26 years, had ever shoved him and made him fall. She told them the next morning. She told them about the silver brooch. She told them about running. She told them about the mail-order advertisement in the back of a Godey's Ladies book she had taken from the parlor, and the letter she had written in the ladies' waiting room at Union Station, and the $2 silver she had left on the letter to pay the postage, because she was not a thief and she would not be one even in flight. She told them everything. She did not weep while she told it. She had done the weeping already, in Chicago, alone. She told it the way a woman tells a story that has finished happening. The three of them listened. None of them spoke. Amos knelt in front of her the whole time. Fletcher stood behind her chair with his hand. She felt it late. She felt it only when it had already been there some minutes, resting very lightly on the back of the chair. Not on her, only on the chair, so that if she needed a shoulder, she would know where a shoulder was. Jubal sat on the hearth with his knees drawn up and his good eye on the fire and his scarred cheek toward her, and his fists were clenched on his knees so tightly the knuckles were white. She finished. She had not taken the brooch. She had not taken anything from that house that was not her own. They did not have to believe her. But that was what happened. Silence. The wind. Then Jubal, who spoke least. Jubal, who had said 3 sentences in a row to her only twice in 6 weeks. Jubal rose from the hearth. He crossed the room. He knelt beside his brother in front of her chair. He did not take her hand. He put both his fists, the white-knuckled fists, on his own knees, and he looked at her with his good eye. "Miss Bishop, I believe you." Fletcher's voice. From behind her, "I believe you." Amos's voice. At her knees, he had believed her before she told him. He needed her to know that. He had believed her the first hour, because a woman who had been called a thief by a rich woman did not carry her mother's Bible the way she carried hers. Thieves carried other things. She carried a book. Marigold put her face in her hands. She wept then, truly wept. Not the small, ashamed weeping of the servant's stare. The great weeping of a woman who has been believed for the first time in her life by 3 men who owed her nothing. Fletcher's hand, she felt it now move from the back of the chair to her shoulder. That was all, just his hand on her shoulder. But she felt, through the wool of her shawl, the shape of the whole house pressing in around her. Amos at her knees, Jubal at her feet, Fletcher at her shoulder, and above them all the wooden cross over the mantel, and the 4th plate at the table where a woman named Hepzibah Wintersong, still, in her sons' hearts, took her supper. And Marigold understood, all at once, the things she had not understood in Chicago, or in Boston, or in the boarding house where her mother had died coughing. This is what a family is. It is not the ones who share your blood. It is the ones who kneel around your chair. Fletcher wrote 3 letters that night. He wrote them at the kitchen table by lamplight, while Marigold sat with her Bible and read the 91st Psalm to herself, over and over, moving her lips soundlessly. The first letter went to a lawyer in Cheyenne named Josiah Merriweather, who had been a boy in Philadelphia in Hepzibah's schoolroom, and who owed her, Fletcher said, more than a lawyer could ever repay. The second letter went to a woman. The second letter went to a woman named Miss Winifred Ashenden, who wrote for the Chicago Tribune and who had made her name, over the last 3 years, on a series of columns titled The Servants' Stairs Accounts, dozens of them, of girls in domestic service in the great houses of Prairie Avenue who had been used badly by the sons of the great houses and then discarded with a false charge to save the family name. The third letter went to a man Fletcher did not name. Marigold saw the address as Fletcher blotted it. Reverend Josiah Bell, Union Chapel Baptist, Chicago South Side. She asked no questions. Fletcher sealed the letters. He set them on the mantel under the cross where he would remember to take them down to Silverbow at first thaw. He looked at her. Did she know what these 3 letters together could do? No. They could make a Chicago family very sorry, Fletcher told her, that they picked a mill girl to lie about. Because a mill girl had friends. A mill girl had a preacher. A mill girl had a lawyer's son who owed her mother's teacher a debt. And a mill girl now had, whether the Ashbournes knew it or not, a newspaper woman who had been waiting for a story exactly like this one for 3 years. He blew out the lamp. Go to bed. It would be a long spring. 10 days later, a rider they knew, a rancher's son from the flats named Coyle, who took the mail up the mountain when the mail was worth carrying, brought a thick envelope for Fletcher. And Fletcher opened it at the kitchen table with steam rising from his coffee. He read it twice. He looked up at Marigold. He read her the important paragraph aloud. Miss Ashenden had received Fletcher's letter. Miss Ashenden was very interested indeed in the account he had provided. Miss Ashenden had, she informed him, already begun her own inquiries into the Ashbourne family some months back. She had a source, she said, in the pawn trade on Halsted Street, who was assisting her in a matter she was not yet at liberty to disclose. She was writing to Miss Bishop through Mr. Merriweather in Cheyenne as well. She thought Miss Bishop should know that a person she had never met, in a city she had left behind, was working on her behalf. She asked Miss Bishop to keep her courage up, and to trust her lawyer, and to trust the men she had found. If they had proved themselves worthy of trust, Miss Ashenden had a good instinct for these things, she said, and Fletcher's letter had told her more about them than Fletcher had probably intended to say. Fletcher folded the letter. He informed Marigold, an ally in Chicago. She did not know, at that moment, whether to weep or to laugh. She did neither. She put her hand on the small cedar cross at her throat, and she pressed it against her collarbone until it left a small warm mark there. And she went outside and stood on the porch for a long time watching the wind move the tops of the pines. But before spring, there was February, and February came for Jubal. It came for him at the North Creek, exactly as it had come for him at 20, except this time he was 28 and blind on one side and alone. He had gone out that morning to check the traps. He had said at breakfast casually, over coffee he would be back by dusk. Do not wait supper. Amos had looked at him. Amos had told him to take Fletcher, and Jubal had said he had gone alone since he was 15, and Amos had said nothing more, because Jubal had said it in the voice that meant he needed to go alone, that he had not gone alone in a long time, that the not going alone had begun, in his own heart, to feel like being pitied. Amos had let him go. Amos would think about that later. Amos would think about it, in fact, for the rest of his life. But at the time, Amos had let him go, because Amos knew, as an older brother knows, that a man who is not allowed to test his own edges becomes a man who has no edges left. Jubal did not come home at dusk. He did not come home at 7, at 8. Amos put on his coat. The mountain lion had tracked him from the ridge. They would piece the story together later, from tracks in the snow. It had followed him a full mile. It had watched him check 3 traps, and when he had knelt at the 4th trap to reset it, it had come down out of a lodgepole pine on his blind side, silent, the way cats are silent, the way the whole world is silent to a man with only one eye when the sound comes from the ear side that no longer hears. He had heard it in the last quarter second. He had turned. His skinning knife had been in his hand because he had been resetting the trap. The cat had taken his shoulder and his upper arm in one bite. He had put the knife into her ribs to the hilt, and twisted. She had let go and staggered off 10 yards and fallen, and not risen again. He had watched her die, on his knees in the snow, with his own blood running down his arm and into the cuff of his glove, and dripping steaming into the snow between his knees. Then he had stood. He had walked. Amos and Marigold found him at the switchback. He was on his feet. That was the thing Marigold could not, afterwards, get out of her mind. He was on his feet. He had walked 2 miles in snow to his hips with his shoulder torn open and his left glove full of blood. And when they came around the bend of the switchback with the lantern, he was standing upright, one shoulder against a pine, breathing in shallow, ragged breaths. And he looked at Amos and said, very calmly, I got the cat. Then he folded to his knees. Then Amos said the only curse word Marigold ever heard him use, before or after, and went to him. Fletcher could not come. Fletcher had stayed at the cabin because someone had to keep the fire, and someone had to boil the water, and someone had to be at the door when they came back. Marigold had insisted on going. Amos had not argued. He had known, even then, that his own leg would not carry him back down the switchback with Jubal on his shoulder, and that a second pair of hands would matter, and that Marigold had those hands, and that she had earned the right to use them. They got Jubal to the horse. They got the horse down the switchback in the dark, Marigold at the bridle, Amos steadying Jubal in the saddle, Jubal talking Jubal, who never talked, was talking too much, was saying things he would not have said sober. I am sorry, Amos. I am sorry I went alone. I am sorry, Miss Bishop. I am sorry your dress will have blood on it. I am so sorry about the dress. It is such a pretty dress. Marigold, walking beside the horse in the snow, holding the bridle, hushed him. It was only a dress. He hushed. For half a mile he hushed. Then, so quietly she almost did not hear, it is not only a dress, it is your only good one. She almost stopped walking. She almost put her forehead against the horse's neck and wept. She kept walking. The kitchen table became an operating table. Fletcher had it ready. He had spread a clean sheet. He had boiled the water. He had laid out the good sewing needles, the ones from her sewing kit, the heavy steel ones for canvas, and heated them in the flame of the lamp until they glowed and then let them cool. He had set out the whiskey bottle and a wooden spoon for Jubal to bite and clean linen strips torn from an old shirt of their mother's, because their mother had wanted her old shirts to have a use. And this was a use, and no one had to say aloud that she would have approved. They laid Jubal on the table. Marigold cut his shirt off. She used the kitchen shears. Her hands did not shake. She would wonder, later, why her hands did not shake. She would decide it was because a woman's hands know, without being told. When there is no time left for the luxury of shaking, the wound was worse than she had feared. The claws had torn 4 deep parallel channels from his shoulder to halfway down his upper arm. The muscle was visible in the deepest of them. The bleeding was slow, which was bad. Slow meant deep, but it was not arterial, which was good. Amos poured whiskey into a tin cup. He held it to Jubal's mouth. Drink. Jubal drank. He grimaced. He drank again. Amos poured whiskey into the wound. Jubal's whole body went stiff. He did not scream. He bit down on the wooden spoon so hard Marigold heard of the wood crack. His good eye squeezed shut. Tears ran from under the closed lid, not from crying, from pain. And Marigold, sitting at the head of the table with a needle in her hand and thread between her teeth, said out loud without meaning to Lord, "Be near him." Then she began to sew. She did not count the stitches while she sewed. Amos counted, for her, quietly, in a low, steady voice. 1, 2, 3, 4. Fletcher held Jubal's hand, his uninjured hand. The right, and Jubal was gripping Fletcher's hand so hard the bones ground together. And Fletcher did not flinch, because Fletcher had held that hand through worse. When they were both boys, and Jubal was 5, and the doctor was setting Jubal's broken finger. And Fletcher had learned then that the way you loved a brother in pain was you did not flinch. 10, 11, 12, she threaded again. 15, 16, she threaded again. 21, 22, somewhere around the 23rd stitch, Jubal, through the wooden spoon, said something. She did not catch it. She paused. Amos, who had caught it, said very quietly to her, he had said, "Thank you." She did not look up. She could not. She kept sewing. 26, 27. Because if she looked up, she would break, and she could not break, because there were still stitches left. 31, 32. She tied off the last knot at 34. She set the needle down. Her hand, which had not shaken through any of it, began, all at once, to shake so violently that she could not have picked the needle back up if she had wanted to. Amos took the needle from the table. I put a cup of water in her hand instead. Same voice he had used on Jubal. Drink, Marigold. Drink, and then rest. She was done. She drank. She rested. The fever came for Jubal that night. Marigold sat by his pallet. They had made a pallet by the hearth so that the heat would reach him through 3 nights and 2 days. Amos took the second watch. Fletcher took the third. But on the 3rd night, when the fever peaked and Jubal began to talk to their mother in his delirium, to say, "Mama, Mama," I did not mean to. It was Marigold who was there. It was Marigold whose hand he clutched. It was Marigold who bathed his forehead with cool cloths and sang, softly, the only song her own mother had ever sung to her, an old Baptist hymn from the Chicago tenements. There is a fountain filled with blood, and it was Marigold, on the 3rd night at 3 in the morning, who felt his hand go slack in hers, and looked at him, and saw that his good eye had opened. It was clear. It was his eye again, not the fever's eye. His. He looked at her. You are still here. She was still there. He closed his eye. He slept real sleep. Not fever sleep for the first time in 3 nights. She sat by the pallet with his hand in hers, and she watched the fire, and she thought, Lord, Lord, I understand it now. I did not understand it before. I understand it now. Whither thou goest, I will go. It is not about a place, Lord. It is about the people the place has in it. The letter from Cheyenne came on the last day of February. It was thick. Fletcher opened it at the kitchen table with all of them watching Jubal in a chair by the fire with his arm in a linen sling, pale but sitting up. Amos leaning on his cane at the corner of the table. Marigold at Fletcher's shoulder. Fletcher read aloud. Dear Fletcher, Josiah Merriweather here. I have news. I hope you are sitting. I hope Miss Bishop is sitting also. Benedict Ashbourne was arrested 3 weeks ago in Chicago on charges of criminal assault against a young laundress named Delfina Ruiz, age 17, in the servants' quarters of his mother's house. Miss Ruiz was not silent. Miss Ruiz went, that same night, to Reverend Josiah Bell of the Union Chapel Baptist, and Reverend Bell went the next morning to Miss Winifred Ashenden of the Tribune, and Miss Ashenden, a woman I have had the honor of dining with twice, and whom I recommend to your household prayers, published. 3 days later, a front-page column titled The Fifth Girl. The Fifth Girl, because Miss Ruiz was the fifth. There were 4 before her. Fletcher, 4. Miss Ashenden had the names, the dates, the addresses, the whole of it. She had been building the file for 2 years. Miss Bishop's name was in the column, not as an accused, as one of the 4 before. Miss Ashenden had traced the false brooch charge to a pawnbroker on Halsted Street who had, in his own ledger, an entry for a silver and garnet mourning brooch received in trade from a household servant of the Ashbourne house, 3 weeks after Miss Bishop had already left Chicago. The servant's name is in the ledger. She is now in the county jail on her own account. Mrs. Ashbourne has been questioned. Mrs. Ashbourne has retained counsel. Benedict Ashbourne will stand trial in April. Miss Bishop is cleared. The Cook County prosecutor withdrew the warrant on the 22nd of February. There is no charge against her in any jurisdiction of the United States. Furthermore, the Ashbourne family, in an attempt to keep Miss Ashenden from publishing further columns, has offered a settlement to each of the 5 girls in the amount of $500 in exchange for no further public statement. I have advised Reverend Bell that the offer is unrelated to the criminal proceedings and may be accepted without prejudice. If Miss Bishop wishes to accept, the funds may be drawn on the First National Bank of Chicago upon presentation of her signature at any Wells Fargo office in the territory. $500. Fletcher, $500 is a homestead. $500 is a small herd. $500 is a train ticket to any city in this country and a year in a boarding house afterwards. Tell Miss Bishop that the money is hers. Tell her also, from an old lawyer who never met her but who owes his letters to your mother, that she owes no one an explanation of what she does with it. Not the family that gave it, not the family that took her in, not the God who kept her breathing until she got to a house with 3 brothers and a wooden cross over the mantel. Tell her that. Your friend, J. Merriweather. Fletcher lowered the letter. The kitchen was silent. Then Jubal, pale, sling on his arm, sitting in his chair by the fire, said one word, Marigold. She looked at him. His good eye was on her face. You are free. She looked around the room. She looked at Amos, leaning on his cane, whose face had gone still and unreadable in the way his face went when he was trying not to let her see what was inside it. She looked at Fletcher, who had folded the letter and was looking down at the folded letter and not at her. She looked at Jubal, in his chair by the fire, with his sling and his scar and his one clear brown eye that was, she now understood, the eye that saw her most clearly of all 3. She spoke out loud, to the whole room. I am not free until I decide what free means. And she went upstairs. She took her mother's Bible up with her. She sat on the edge of the bed. She opened the Bible at random, the way her mother used to open it when she did not know what to pray about, the old Baptist habit, half superstition, half faith, and she looked down at the page her thumb had found. Ruth, chapter 1, verse 16. Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee, for whither thou goest. I will go, and where thou lodgest. I will lodge, thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. She read it once, she read it twice, she read it a 3rd time, the way Fletcher had taught her, slow, like a woman who meant it. Then she closed the Bible, she put her hand flat on the cover, and she said aloud, to the empty room, to her dead mother, to Hepzibah Wintersong, whose handkerchief she had folded in the top drawer of the washstand, To the three broken men downstairs whose broken places had somehow, in 3 months, mended a place in her that she had thought was past mending, I have decided. Downstairs, on the porch, Amos was standing in the cold with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand. He was looking at the ridge. He was praying, silently, the shortest prayer he knew, Lord. If it is not me, let it not be me. But Lord, let it be one of us. Let her stay. Let her stay in this house. The wind moved through the pines. The wind did not answer. But upstairs, a girl he had brought home in November closed a Bible on a bed he had never once slept in, and made a choice she would not tell any of them for another 6 weeks, because it was not the kind of choice you told. It was the kind of choice you lived, and she had already begun to live it, and the living of it would be the whole of the spring. March came in slow, not with sun, with water. The snowpack began to rot from underneath, porous, gray, treacherous, and the switchback trail turned into a river of mud that froze at night into ankle-breaking ruts and thawed by noon into brown slush. The pines dripped, the eaves dripped, the cabin roof shed sheets of old snow that hit the porch with sounds like small collapses. And inside the cabin, something else was thawing. Marigold could feel it in the air, the way a person feels weather coming, a shift, a pressure change, a knowledge in the bones that could not yet be named. The three brothers moved around her differently. Amos had begun sleeping in the downstairs room again, the one that had been made up for him from the first day. The one he had refused for 4 months, and he had done it without asking permission and without announcing it. She had simply come down one morning and seen his boots by his own bed, and had understood that he had decided, on his own, that she was safe from him, and therefore he could be safe from the barn. Fletcher had begun singing, small snatches of it, under his breath, while he chopped kindling, while he mended a bridle, while he shaved at the washstand, a low, true baritone she had not known he possessed, running through the old Baptist tunes and the old Scots ballads their mother had raised them on. He would stop the moment he noticed her listening, embarrassed, and then 20 minutes later he would start again. He did not know he was doing it. That was the whole point. Jubal his arm out of the sling now. Though he could not yet lift a full hammer, Jubal had begun building. Building what? She did not know. He would disappear into the smithy after breakfast, and she would hear the sounds of planing wood, not iron, and she would smell cedar shavings on his shirt at supper. He would not answer when Fletcher teased him about it. He would only glance at Marigold, once, with his good eye, a glance so fast she almost missed it, and go back to his stew. She said nothing. She was learning that this house did not require its questions to be asked. This house delivered its answers in their own time, and the time was almost always right. On the second Saturday of March, she walked out along the ridge to the pine. She had asked Fletcher, the night before, where his mother was buried, and he had told her 200 yards east of the great spruce, under a smaller pine, and there was no marker because Hepzibah had refused a stone. She had said, before she died, that she did not want a stone. She had said the pine would do. The pine would outlast a stone anyway, and it would grow, and a stone would only sit. Marigold walked out in the raw March wind with Hepzibah's handkerchief folded flat inside her Bible and the small cedar cross warm at her throat. She found the pine. It was younger than the spruce, but it was already tall, and the earth beneath it was banked slightly higher than the ground around it, in the way earth banks itself over a grave that is settled. She sat down on the wet ground. She unfolded the handkerchief and laid it flat on the earth in front of her. She did not speak for a long time. Then quietly, she began. She thanked Hepzibah for the handkerchief. She thanked her for the sons. She thanked her for the shelf of books and the cross above the mantel and the fourth plate that was still on the table and the recipe for biscuits she was, slowly in her own hands, beginning to learn. She thanked her for teaching Amos that a man who could not read was a man another man could lie to, and for teaching Fletcher to notice, and for teaching Jubal to touch a wounded thing softly. She thanked her for raising the man Marigold Bishop had decided to marry. She said the man's name out loud, Jubal. She said she hoped, wherever Hepzibah was, that Hepzibah could see it, because she was going to marry Jubal in June under the great spruce, if the mountain permitted her that long, and she wanted Hepzibah to know she had chosen him freely, and that she had chosen him not despite the scar, but including it, and that the wedding ring was going to be iron because that was what Jubal knew how to make. And Marigold thought that was better than gold anyway, because iron was what held a house together, and gold was only what people spent to prove they had it. She wept a little. She dried her eyes on her sleeve, because the handkerchief was not for that. The handkerchief was for the earth. She folded it back into the Bible. She stood up. She walked back to the cabin. Fletcher was on the porch splitting kindling. He looked at her once as she came up the steps, and he did not ask her where she had been, and she did not tell him. And she understood that he had known, and that he had let her go alone, and that this was the kindness he was best at. The Wells Fargo office at Silver Bow had $500 on account for one Marigold Bishop, endorsable on presentation of signature and one witness. She rode down on the second week of March. She rode alone. Not because Amos would not have taken her. He had offered. So had Jubal. Fletcher had offered to write ahead to a woman he knew at the boarding house, so she would have a proper meal and a proper bed. Marigold had refused all three. Not sharply, warmly. She had told them she needed to ride the switchback alone once. She needed to know she could. And Amos, who understood the shape of a woman's need to prove a thing to herself, had saddled the smallest mare and put her up in the saddle and stepped back. She rode. The mud sucked at the mare's hooves. The wind was raw. Twice she thought the horse would slip, and twice the horse did not. She reached Silver Bow at noon. She did the business at the bank. She signed her name in the ledger, Marigold Bishop, and the clerk counted out $500 in mixed currency, and she took a leather wallet from her shawl and put the money in it and signed the receipt. And the clerk, who was a young man with pomade in his hair, looked at her with a kind of dazzled uncertainty because $500 was not a sum. A young woman came into Silver Bow to collect on an ordinary Wednesday, and he did not know what to make of her. She did not explain herself to him. She realized as she stepped out onto the plank sidewalk with the wallet against her ribs. Stopped explaining herself to anyone. Something in her had shifted, and she noticed it, and she kept walking. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment with the wallet warm against her ribs and thought, $500. I am a woman with $500 on a March afternoon in Wyoming territory, with the sun coming out for the first time in a week. My mother did not live to see this. My mother would have wept to see this. My mother would have said, Marigold, you keep hold of that money. You do not let a man near that money. Mama, I am not going to let a man near this money. I am going to let 3 men near it, because it is going to buy something none of us have ever had. It is going to buy the rest of the pole barn Amos has been trying to finish for 2 years. It is going to buy Fletcher a new shelf of books that our mother would have wept over. It is going to buy Jubal the good English steel he has been rationing since October. And it is going to buy me, Mama. Are you listening, a wedding dress? A proper one. In blue. Because I am not going down that aisle in the brown wool I have worn every day since November. Mama, I am not. She was smiling. She realized she was smiling. Alone on a sidewalk in Silver Bow, and a woman in a stiff, high-collar dress across the street had noticed the smile and was staring. And Marigold, instead of ducking her head, instead of turning her face away, instead of shrinking the way a mill girl shrinks, smiled at the woman too. The woman looked away first. It was on the corner of Bridge Street, where she had stopped to buy a sack of good coffee beans and 3 yards of navy wool from the general store, that she met the woman with the parasol. The woman was Mrs. Ellsworth Vance. She introduced herself, unbidden, in the way of women who assume their names carry weight in rooms they have not yet entered, and Mrs. Vance was the wife of the president of the First Bank of Silver Bow, and Mrs. Vance was the founder of the Ladies' Auxiliary of the Methodist Church. And Mrs. Vance had, she said as she stepped out from under her striped parasol onto the plank sidewalk, been hoping to meet you, my dear, for some weeks now. Marigold, with the sack of coffee in one arm and the navy wool folded over the other, allowed that Mrs. Vance had, apparently, been hoping. Mrs. Vance had heard Marigold had come up to the Wintersong place. From Chicago. Was it? Mail order arrangement. Correct. You poor child. Marigold set the sack of coffee down on a rain barrel. She did it slowly. She wanted her hands free. She begged Mrs. Vance's pardon. Mrs. Vance repeated herself. You poor child. She opened and closed her parasol as she spoke, a nervous gesture she had probably been doing since girlhood. And she was, Marigold saw, not a cruel woman, she was a certain kind of foolish woman, which was worse in some ways, because a cruel woman knew she was cruel and could be reasoned with. But a foolish woman thought she was being kind. Living in that cabin with 3 broken men, no one would judge her if she left. The auxiliary had a discretionary fund. There was a train east on Fridays. Mrs. Vance could see her personally to the platform. There need be no scandal. She could tell people whatever she wished. Marigold looked at her. She looked at the parasol. She looked at the small, pale gloves. She thought very clearly, very calmly, Lord, this woman thinks she is saving me. Then she smiled. Not the polite mill-girl smile she had been taught in the Ashbourne house. A different smile. A smile she had learned from Fletcher, over some poetry, 3 weeks back. A smile that was slow and did not quite reach the mouth, but reached everywhere else. Mrs. Vance, she said. She thanked her for her kindness. She was going to speak now, and she was going to speak plainly, and she asked her to hear her out. Mrs. Vance opened her parasol again. The 3 broken men in that cabin, Marigold told her, were the wholest men she had ever met in her life. Amos limped because he threw his body between his brother and a grizzly bear when he was 25 years old, and he would do it again tomorrow. And the leg was the price he paid for the kind of love most people never learn to spell. Fletcher was deaf in one ear because he had scarlet fever as a small boy, in a house where his mother sat up with him for 11 nights running until the fever broke. And he had been, ever since, the kindest and most literate man in a 100-mile radius. And he had taught her to read Shakespeare and Spurgeon by the same fire in the same house that had made him deaf. Jubal was blind in one eye because a mountain lion had tried to take his face and only got half of it. And he had, since the day she walked into that cabin, seen her more clearly than any 2-eyed man ever had. Mrs. Vance's parasol had stopped moving. Ma'am, Marigold said, she did not need her fund. She did not need her train. She did not need her discretion, because she had nothing to be discreet about. She had a home. She had a family, and she would ask her, respectfully, because she was a Christian woman, and her mother had raised her to be a Christian woman, and she would not curse her on a plank sidewalk in Silverbow. She would ask Mrs. Vance to keep her auxiliary fund for the women in this town who actually required her saving. Because there were some. There were always some. And they would not be found up on Wintersong Ridge. She picked up her coffee sack. She lifted her navy wool. She turned. She walked away. Behind her, she did not turn to check, but she heard it. Mrs. Ellsworth Vance closed her parasol. She did not open it again. She rode home in a lightning rain that smelled of pine sap and turned over earth. She was singing. Under her breath, she did not know she was doing it. It was one of the tunes Fletcher had been singing without meaning to. The old Scots ballad about the woman who went to the wood and green. And Marigold had picked it up out of the air of the house the way a child picks up any word that has been said around her often enough. When she came around the last bend and the cabin appeared through the wet pines, she saw all 3 of them on the porch. They had been watching for her. They had been watching for her all afternoon. Amos with his cane. Fletcher with a book he was pretending to read. Jubal, the one who was supposed to be resting, leaning against a porch post with his good arm crossed over his slinged arm and his good eye on the switchback. She reined in at the porch steps. She looked at the 3 of them. From the saddle, without preamble, she asked which of them would like to know what she was going to do with $500. Fletcher grinned. He grinned the crooked left side grin. Whatever she wished. Miss Bishop, Amos told her quietly. Jubal said nothing. Jubal was looking at her the way he looked at iron when the iron was ready. Marigold swung down out of the saddle. She handed Amos the coffee sack. She handed Fletcher the wool. She looked at Jubal. Jubal Wintersong. What was he building in the smithy? His good eye flicked away. His scarred cheek reddened. She had asked him a question. She reminded him. He looked back. A cradle. Silence. Fletcher, on the porch, went perfectly still with the navy wool in his arms. Amos, on the porch, set the coffee sack down and put both his hands on the head of his cane. Marigold's own breath had stopped. She had not asked him what she thought she had asked him. She had not been expecting. She had thought he was building a chest, or a bookcase, or, in a voice that did not sound like her own, she repeated the word, a cradle. For whoever needed one, Jubal said, someday. He said it looking at his boots. Then, still looking at his boots, or for no one. If no one needed one. He had only wanted to know he could still make one. With the one arm, he had wanted to try. Marigold set her leather wallet down on the porch step. She walked up the porch steps. She walked past Amos. She walked past Fletcher. She walked up to Jubal Wintersong. She reached up with her right hand, the hand that had once burned itself on a skillet in a kitchen and been anointed with wild honey by this man, and she laid the hand, very softly, flat against the scarred cheek. Her palm covered the pale line of the claw. His good eye closed. His breath went out of him all at once, as if he had been holding it for 4 months and had only just now been given permission to let it go. She spoke so only he could hear. Jubal, look at me. He opened his eye. Tonight, she told him, after supper, she was going to speak to Amos, and then she was going to speak to Fletcher, and then she was going to speak to him, and she wanted him to know, before she spoke to anyone, what she was going to say, because he was the one whose face had been in her mind. Not first, but most, and most was the one that mattered. When a woman had had time to think, he did not move. His good eye had filled. Miss Bishop, he said, so low she almost did not catch it. I cannot Marigold. She corrected him. Say it, once, so she could hear him say it once. His mouth worked. Marigold. Again. Marigold. She took her hand off his face. She stepped back. She turned to the other two on the porch. Fletcher was looking at the porch boards. His grin was gone. His eyes were wet. He had known she understood now. From the wetness of his eyes he had known for weeks. Fletcher knew everything in this house before it happened. It was his one great gift and his one great sorrow. Amos was looking at her, straight at her. His face was still, but the corners of his eyes were crinkled, the smile the mouth had forgotten, that only the eyes remembered, and she understood. In the same second, that Amos had known too. Amos had known from the first week. Amos had chosen, from the first week, not to compete. Amos had loved her exactly enough to make sure she was free to love someone else. And he had done it with the kind of quiet, steady, daily discipline that most men, given a lifetime, never learn. She spoke to him, gently. Amos, Marigold. Might she speak with him first, before supper, on the porch, alone? He nodded. Of course, Marigold. He said her name in a way she had heard him say it only twice before the night of the fever. And just now, and she felt, in the way of a woman who has begun at last to hear her own heart, that Amos was giving her something with the shape of her name that would take her the rest of her life to properly repay. They sat on the porch bench, 2 feet apart, the distance they had settled on in November, the distance they had never once discussed and would not discuss now. The rain had stopped. The clouds had opened over the ridge. The sun, the first true sun in 5 days, was catching in the wet pines and turning the whole ridge to hammered brass. Before she could begin, Amos told her he knew what she was going to say. Did he? I had known for 6 weeks, maybe longer. Since the night at the smithy when Jubal had made her bend the iron, he had seen her face. He had not been a young man in a long time, he reminded her, but he remembered what a face looked like when it had been struck. She was quiet. Amos, she said. She wanted him to know something. If he had been a different man, if he had reached for her in November, when she was so afraid she could not think, she would have flinched, and she would have hated him for it, and she would have left this cabin in April with a wallet of $500, and she would never have looked back. I was looking at the ridge. He did not look at her. He had never looked directly at her for a full conversation in 4 months. It was, she understood now, another one of his kindnesses, the kindness of not weighing her down with a look she had not asked to carry. I had not reached, she said. He had slept in the barn. He had brought her coffee at 3 every day. He had taught her the stove. He had knelt on the floor by her bed the night of the fever, and he had not touched her. He had held a lamp. He had sung a hymn. He did not remember the second verse of. He still did not remember it. Amos admitted. It had been bothering him for 4 months. Amos, he was sorry. Please continue. She almost laughed. She did not laugh. This was not the moment. If he had reached, she would have run. Because he had not reached. She had stayed, and because she had stayed, she had learned that a man could be signed on a piece of paper as her husband and be, in his own heart, the finest brother a woman had ever had. That was what he was to her, and it was not less than what a husband was. It was different, but it was not less, and she would not trade it for a different thing, even if the different thing was him and her alone in a cabin without his brothers. Did he understand what she was telling him? I was still looking at the ridge. She was telling him she loved him the way a woman loves the man who taught her that a man could be trusted. Yes, and that she loved Jubal a different way. She nodded. Once, and that she would like his blessing to marry him. Yes. The pause was long. Then Amos said, very quietly, that he was going to say something now, and he was going to say it once, and then they were going to go inside and have supper and never speak of it again. Because if they spoke of it again, he would not be able to keep his composure. And a man ought to keep his composure in the house where he had slept and eaten and prayed. Was she listening? She was listening. I had loved her since the second week of November. He had loved her the way a man loves the last light of a long day. Not desperately, not greedily, only completely. And he had known, since December, that Jubal loved her the way a young man loves the first light of a long day, which was the kind of love a young woman was made to be loved with. And he had chosen, every single day since he understood the shape of it, to step out of her way, because she was 19, and Jubal was 28, and he was 33, and lamed, and slow, and he had been given a wife once, in this cabin, and she had died in the second year of it, and he did not have another wife's death in him. He could not have watched her look at Jubal across a supper table for the rest of his life and pretended he did not see it. So he had made a decision, and he had made it early, and he wanted her to know he had made it freely. Did she hear him? She was crying, silently, her hand over her mouth, the way she had learned in Chicago. Amos, without turning, without looking, without breaking his gaze from the ridge, put his hand on the bench between them, palm up, and left it there. She put her hand in his. For the first time in 4 months, they touched. His hand was rough as fence wood and warm and enormous and unbelievably still. Amos, she said, threw the hand over her mouth. Marigold. Would he give her away? At the wedding. Yes. Instead of her father, she had no father, and he had been more than one to her. So yes, instead of her father. He was quiet. Then, still looking at the ridge, it would be his privilege. He did not let go of her hand. She did not let go of his. They sat like that until the sun went behind the ridge and the mountain went blue with evening. And then they stood up together because it was time for supper. And no one in the Wintersong house had ever been late for supper in the whole of Amos's memory of it, and they went inside. The wedding was on the third Sunday in June. They held it out of doors, under the great spruce that stood at the eastern corner of the property, the oldest tree on the ridge, the tree Hepzibah Wintersong had planted the year she had first come to the mountain, 60 years back, as a young governess who had no notion at all that she would one day raise 3 unrelated boys under it. The tree had grown into a cathedral. Its lowest branches spread 20 feet across, and someone she suspected Fletcher had strung the branches with strips of white linen so that they moved in the mountain wind like slow benedictions. Reverend Elijah Hawthorne came up from Silverbow. I had known Hepzibah 40 years. He had married her, in this same cabin, to the man who had built it, a man dead now these 32 years, whose name none of the 3 boys had ever borne. He had baptized all 3 of the boys. He had buried Hepzibah on this very ridge, under a smaller pine 200 yards east of the spruce, and he had refused all payment for the burial. And he had said at the graveside, Marigold had heard this from Fletcher, that Hepzibah Wintersong had a chair saved for her at a very large table, and the Lord would keep it warm. Now he stood under her spruce. He had come up on a mule. He was 70 years old, and he had come up on a mule through the June mud because Fletcher had written him a letter that had ended with the words, "She is a girl our mother would have loved." And that had been the whole of the argument the Reverend had needed. He wore his black coat. He held a small, worn book of the Baptist service. He looked at Marigold when she came out of the cabin on Amos's arm, in the blue dress she had cut and sewn herself from 3 yards of navy wool bought in Silverbow. The collar high, the sleeves long, the whole of it stitched with a needle her mother had left her, and he did what an old preacher does when he sees a bride he already loves through the report of her family. He nodded. Once. That was all. But it was enough. Amos gave her away. He walked her from the cabin door to the spruce with his cane in his right hand and her hand tucked in the crook of his left arm. The strong arm. The one that had always been the strong one. The one that had carried Jubal in from the North Creek on a bloody February night, and he did not limp. Or he limped and did not show it. And Marigold felt his forearm under her fingers as steady as the mountain itself. Fletcher stood as best man. He wore a black coat. He had cut his hair. She suspected Jubal had done it, because it was uneven at the back in a way Fletcher would never have permitted for himself, and he had shaved, and his green eyes were red-rimmed, and he stood at his brother's right shoulder like a man who had been rehearsing this moment in his head for years and was surprised to find, on arriving at it, that his heart was breaking exactly the correct amount, which is to say not too much and not too little, and enough to know that a good thing was happening to people he loved. Jubal stood under the spruce. He wore a dark blue shirt. His yellow hair had been combed. His scar was in the shade of the great branches. And for once it looked, not like a wound, but like the ordinary weathering of a man who had lived long enough to have a story. His arm was out of the sling. He held it stiffly at his side. His good eye did not leave Marigold from the moment she stepped out of the cabin door to the moment she stopped in front of him under the tree. Amos placed her right hand in Jubal's right hand. Amos stepped back. Amos did not speak. Reverend Hawthorne opened his book. He read the old words, the words she had heard read over other people all her life, in other churches, from other pulpits, in the flat prairie tongues of Illinois. But under a great spruce in the Wyoming mountains, in the mouth of an old man who had known the mother of the man she was marrying, the words sounded, for the first time, as if they had been written for her. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God, and in the face of this company, to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony. Marigold did not weep. She had done the weeping earlier, alone, in her mother's Bible upstairs. She had wept over the underlined passages in the book of Ruth. She had wept over the pencil that had run out and the charcoal that had continued. She had wept for Hephzibah Wintersong, whose handkerchief was folded into the seam of her sleeve where a bride's mother's handkerchief traditionally went, and who was, she was quite sure of it, sitting somewhere in the branches of her own spruce and watching. When it came time for her vows, she said them in her own steady voice, and she added because Reverend Hawthorne had asked her, quietly, the night before, if she had any words of her own she wished to speak, and she had said yes and told him what she added, looking Jubal in his one clear brown eye. Jubal Wintersong, I take you as my husband because you have been the truest man to me, from the first morning, on the small thing and on the great thing alike, because you brought honey for a burn before you brought a word for a stranger, because you built a cradle in a smithy in March with one working arm, because you saw me when you had every reason not to look, and you did not flinch, and you have taught me by not flinching that I do not have to flinch either. I will keep your house. I will keep your name. I will keep your peace when the peace is mine to keep, and I will keep it for us both when it is not. And I will try again, every night, every morning. For as long as God lets me stand under this spruce beside you, Jubal said his vows in a voice she had never heard from him, the voice of a young man saying something he had waited his whole life to be permitted to say. He said, when it came his turn to add his own words, only one sentence, Marigold Bishop, I was not looking for a wife. I had stopped looking for a wife. And then you walked into my brother's cabin in November, and I understood, in the first hour, that I had never stopped looking. I had only stopped believing I would find. I have been finding you every day since. I will keep finding you, God willing, until the last day. Fletcher produced a ring. It was small. It was iron. It was set with a piece of turquoise no bigger than a pea. Jubal had made it in March. He slid it onto her finger. His good eye finally met hers, with nothing held back. Reverend Hawthorne closed his book. By the authority of the Baptist Church of Silver Bow and the territory of Wyoming, he pronounced them husband and wife. Jubal Winter Song. He might kiss his bride. Jubal did not move. For one long second he did not move. She saw the fear in him. The fear that had been in him since November. The fear of a young man who had been told all his life that a scarred face is a face no woman will freely choose. And Marigold, who had chosen, and had chosen freely, and had chosen him, went up on her toes and put her hand once more on his scarred cheek and kissed him first. The wedding party, Amos, Fletcher, Reverend Hawthorne, and Sylvanus the wagon driver, who had come up out of pure sentimental curiosity and been permitted to stay, made the sound wedding parties make. Amos made the sound loudest. High was, she saw when she opened her eyes, weeping openly, and he was not hiding it, and Fletcher was standing beside him with one hand on his brother's shoulder. And Fletcher was weeping too. And the two of them stood there under the spruce like two men who had raised a boy together and were watching the boy claim the whole of his life. And Marigold understood that she had not been given away only by Amos. She had been given away by all three. They ate on the porch. Roast venison, biscuits hers, golden, right side of the stove, a wedge of yellow cheese Sylvanus had brought up as a wedding gift, and a small cake with sugar Fletcher had sent for from Cheyenne and paid for out of a fund none of them asked him about. They ate until the sun went behind the ridge and the mountain went blue. Then Amos, at his end of the table, tapped his tin cup with his knife. The porch went quiet. He stood. I was not a man for speeches. He told them he was going to make a short one anyway, because a brother had been married today, and a brother was expected to say something on such occasions. And he had been told by his mother, who taught him most of what he knew about being a brother, and all of what he knew about being a decent man, that a promise made in front of witnesses was a stronger promise than one made in private. So, he looked at Jubal. Jubal, I was the best of them. He had always been the best of them. Fletcher and Amos had known this for 28 years, and Marigold had known it for 4 months, and Amos was glad that it was a truth now shared by more than only his brothers. He looked at Marigold. Marigold Bishop Wintersong. The new name went through her like a bell. She had come to a mountain in November, he told her, as a woman who did not know she was permitted to want anything. She was leaving this porch tonight as a woman who had chosen, freely and clearly, what she wanted and whom she wanted it with. He had watched that change over 4 months, and it had been the finest thing he had ever watched, and he would remember it on his deathbed. That was his speech. He raised his cup. To the bride, he said, who kept the fire burning in a house that had forgotten how. They drank. Fletcher stood. He would make it shorter. He warned them. Marigold. She had made his brother laugh in his sleep for the first time in 8 years. Fletcher had heard him from across the hall. He had not thought he would hear it again in his life. Whatever else she had done for this house, that alone would have been enough. May she always make him laugh in his sleep. They drank. Jubal stood last. I was slower to rise. His arm was stiff. He did not raise a cup. He simply stood, and he looked at Marigold, and he spoke in his low, unhurried voice. Marigold. I was not a talker, so he would only say this. The first hour that she had walked into this cabin, he could not look at her. He could not look at her because he had never seen a thing so beautiful. And he had thought that if he looked too long, she would see the half of his face that was not a face anymore. And she would flinch. She had not flinched. Not the first hour. Not the first day. Not any day. So he had stopped hiding his scar from her. And then, when he had stopped hiding it, he had noticed that she had stopped hiding whatever it was she had come to this mountain hiding. And he had understood, in the same second, that hiding was a thing two frightened people could teach each other to stop doing, if they were patient enough, and if God was kind enough, and if the winter was long enough. He paused. The winter had been long enough, he said quietly. God had been kind enough. He had her, and he would spend the rest of his life being patient enough. He sat down. Nobody drank. Nobody spoke. Fletcher was crying again. Amos was looking at the ridge with his mouth pressed shut. Sylvanus, who had known none of them well but had brought a wheel of cheese up a switchback for the wedding, was blowing his nose into a red bandana and muttering that it was the pollen, the June pollen, dreadful season for the eyes. Marigold sat with her hand in her husband's hand. She thought clearly, calmly. For the first time in her life, I am home. I am home. I have never in my life been home before, and I did not know what home was, and I have found it in a cabin in Wyoming Territory with 3 broken men and a 4th plate at the table for a woman who has been dead 3 years and is not gone. This is home. I did not know a person could feel this. Mama, Mama, do you see me? Mama, I hope you see me. Reverend Hawthorne went back down the mountain that night on his mule. Sylvanus went with him, chewing tobacco, whistling. Fletcher went to his room upstairs at the far end of the house. Amos went to his room downstairs, his room, at last permanently his, and closed the door softly and did not open it again until morning. Marigold and Jubal went to the room she had slept in alone for 7 months. He carried her over the threshold, not because it was required, because he had wanted to since November, and had said as much once to Fletcher when he thought she was not listening. And Fletcher had told her, 3 days ago, in confidence, and she had smiled and pretended not to have been told. He set her down beside the bed. She looked at him. I was trembling, not fear trembling. The other kind, the kind a man trembles when he has waited a long time for a good thing and can barely believe he has at last permitted it. His good eye was fixed on her face. His scarred cheek was turned toward the window, so that the last violet light of the June evening caught the pale line of the claw and made it for one moment look like a thing that had healed rather than a thing that had wounded. In a whisper that was less voice than breath, Marigold. He had never. She put her fingers over his mouth. Shh. He hushed. She had not either. She told him. So they were going to figure it out together. And if tonight was clumsy, they would laugh. And if tonight she needed to stop, he would stop. And if tonight she paused, she smiled up at him, the slow smile she had been practicing on Mrs. Vance and the general store clerk and the Wells Fargo teller and everyone else in Wyoming Territory who had needed to see it. And if tonight hurts, Jubal. Then she waited. She let him finish the sentence, because she had waited 7 months for a man to be able to finish a sentence with her, and she wanted the man who finished it to be him. Jubal Wintersong bent his forehead to hers. He closed his good eye. He whispered, into her hair, into the June wind, into the 4-month conversation that had begun on the night of a blizzard, when a different woman lay under different quilts and clutched a different man's coat and did not know that any of this was coming. Then we will try again tomorrow night. She laughed. She laughed with her forehead against his forehead and her hands in his yellow hair and the iron ring, the ring he had made her with one working arm in the smithy in March, pressing warm against the back of his neck. Yes, yes, that was the answer. That had always been the answer. And she kissed him. Love is not always a story you can tell in one night. Sometimes love is a story you tell across a winter. Sometimes love is a girl who came to a mountain with a Bible and 2 silver dollars and no idea what she was walking into. And sometimes it is 3 broken men who did not know, until she arrived, that the roof over their heads had been leaking for 3 years in a place none of them had thought to look. Amos Wintersong lost his leg because he loved his brother more than he loved his own body. He never got the leg back, but he got to give the bride away under his mother's spruce, and he got to say the words he had rehearsed all winter, and he got to sit on the porch afterwards with a cup of coffee and watch the mountain go blue. And no one on that porch ever again mistook his silence for the silence of a lonely man. Fletcher Wintersong could not hear on one side because a mother he loved sat up with him 11 nights. He could not save her when it was her turn to be sick. But he lived long enough to write 3 letters that saved a young woman he came to love as a sister. And he lived long enough to hear his youngest brother laugh in his sleep again. And he was, until the end of his life, the man in the family who noticed things first and said nothing about most of them. Jubal Wintersong lost half his sight to a mountain lion when he was 20. What he kept the one clear eye was, for the rest of his days, the eye that a certain young woman said saw her more truly than any 2-eyed man had ever seen her. He made her an iron ring with a piece of turquoise no bigger than a pea. She wore it for 45 years. She was buried with it on, at her own request, under a great spruce on a ridge in Wyoming. And Marigold Bishop, the girl from the Chicago Mills who once whispered, "It hurts. Let's try again tomorrow night," from under three quilts, on a night when she thought she was talking about her soul. Marigold Bishop learned, in a house with a cross over the mantel and a fourth plate at the table. That try again tomorrow night was not an admission of weakness. It was a whole theology. It was, in the end, the whole shape of grace. Because grace does not demand that you be brave the first night. Grace does not demand that you be whole. Grace does not even demand that you be certain. Grace only asks that you keep waking up in the same house, with the same people, and trying again, every night, every morning, every winter, and every spring, and every long, slow thaw between them. Until, one June evening, under a great spruce your mother-in-law planted before you were born, you look up into the one clear eye of a man who has waited for you the whole of the winter, and you understand, at last, that the mountain has been trying, all this time, to teach you the simplest sentence in the human language. You are home. You are home. You are home.